It had been years since I had spent time alone in the house. There was always activity going on, whether it was Rose, the kids, or work. However, this past weekend was different. Rose was visiting her parents in Florida with our two boys, Ethan and Jake. For weeks, she had been coordinating every aspect of the vacation, including making sure the kids packed everything and scheduling flights. Me, I remained behind. A tranquil house sounded like a much-needed respite from the demanding nature of work. I prepared a leisurely meal for myself, reclined on the couch, and relished the quiet on my first night by myself. There were no arguments about bedtime, and there were no cartoons playing in the background. Me and my ideas alone. A knock on the door disturbed me at approximately 9:00 p.m. When I opened it, I saw Greg, my neighbor. Greg, a retired police officer in his late 50s, continued to behave as though he was still on duty. He was constantly watching, always aware of who was coming and going. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped onto the porch and said, "Hey, Jeff, I watched Rose and the children go earlier. I take it you're flying alone?" I gave a nod. Indeed, an uncommon instance of tranquility. Greg laughed and leaned a little closer. "Hey, I just wanted to let you know. Around my house, I put in some new security cameras. Have you ever considered purchasing some?" I scowled. "Security cameras? We live in a safe neighborhood after all." Greg gave a shrug. "They all say that until anything occurs." He tapped his temple. "You'd be surprised how many break-ins occur when people let their guards down. A few days ago, a man I know who lives 4 blocks away had his house broken into. Just something to consider." I shook my head and laughed. "Thank you for your concern, Greg, but I believe I'll be all right." He raised his hands and said, "Suit yourself. Just keep in mind that being ready is preferable to being sorry." I closed the door after him, brushing the thought aside. It seemed pointless to have cameras. However, I kept thinking as I lay in bed that night, what if I was unaware that someone was in my home? That concept had developed into something I couldn't ignore by morning. I therefore placed an order for a set of cameras that could transmit live video to my phone after perusing web sales. I convinced myself that it wasn't paranoia. It was merely an additional safety measure. I installed the cameras for an afternoon after they arrived. I placed one camera in the backyard, another at the front door, and a third one inside, next to the living room. I even used the app to test them, tracking my movements in real time. I closed my phone and carried on with my day, feeling strangely relieved. I should have known then, but I didn't, that I had just positioned myself to view something I wasn't supposed to see. The days that followed went quickly. I was relishing the seclusion in the calm house. On Sunday afternoon, Rose and the children returned, finally breaking the silence. The children were running around Rose as she entered the house, yelling and laughing and causing the same old mayhem. I could hear Rose's soft voice, attempting to mediate the argument between Ethan and Jake over who should sit where on the couch. As I watched everything come together, I grinned to myself. Normal. Family. Everything felt normal again. It wasn't until it returned that I understood how much I had missed it. Now that the house was entire again, it had felt too empty. In the last few days, I hadn't given the cameras any thought. To be honest, I simply relished spending time with my family and getting back to our regular schedule. That peaceful moment would be the last time everything felt normal, even though I was unaware of it at the time. On a Tuesday afternoon, as I was going through emails at my desk at work, the idea of the cameras suddenly came back to me. Perhaps it was the feeling of silence in the back of my mind, but I thought I'd take a brief look at the video. I launched my phone's camera app and browsed through the videos. Until I paused on one from the previous Saturday afternoon, nothing seemed unusual. I observed Rose chatting to someone at the front entrance on the video. It appeared innocent enough at first. Then a tall, stocky man wearing a dark jacket came inside. Rose's smile was familiar to me. It pleased her to see him. However, who was he? I had no idea who he was. As the man moved deeper into the house, I leaned closer and paused the video. He moved in a way that was almost too familiar. He wasn't unfamiliar. He knew where to go. A beat skipped in my chest. In an attempt to make sense of everything, I watched the video again. Perhaps it was just a coworker or a friend of hers that I was unfamiliar with, but my uneasiness increased as I watched more. I should have confronted Rose and called her. However, I didn't. It was impossible for me to do so. Rather, I simply pushed my phone into my pocket and closed the app. I had trouble sleeping that night. I couldn't stop imagining that man, his gestures, how at ease he seemed in my house. I made an effort to ignore it. I might have been overanalyzing it. After a few days, I was unable to resist. I needed to double check. I launched the app again and sifted through additional video from the days following Rose's return. And once more he appeared. The same individual. I stood motionless as he passed through the home once more. He was laughing with Rose in the living room this time. Sitting on the couch together, I could see them conversing. This was no haphazard visit. He was acquainted with Rose, knew our home. There was a problem. I was no longer able to ignore it. I added 3 more cameras, one for the kitchen, one for the living room, and one for the bedroom. I kept it from Rose. I didn't want to come across as suspicious, but I was unable to stop it. I had to know this man's identity. I didn't sit down to review the video again until late at night, a week later. There was silence in the house. Rose and the children were sleeping, not knowing what I was going to find out. I only expected regular quotidian occurrences, nothing special. Rose is spending time with the children. Rose is preparing food. Perhaps that man will return. Perhaps not. By clicking through the timestamps, I was able to fast forward through the typical scenes of the home, such as Rose cleaning the kitchen and the kids playing in the backyard. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I noticed the footage of the bedroom. I was filled with nausea. With my heart pounding in my chest, I clicked the file. For a brief moment, I could only see Rose standing beside the bed as the video loaded. Then he entered a few seconds later. The same individual. My fingers hurt from holding my phone so tightly. Rose seems unsurprised. She didn't question his purpose for being there. She didn't shoo him off. She grabbed him. As I watched them kiss, their hands drawing each other closer, my breath seized in my throat. They were whispering something, but I didn't have to hear what they were saying. It was obvious from the way they moved and gazed at one another. Too obvious. Then their garments came off, one by one. I turned off my phone. I had trembling hands. I felt cold all over. He was not an ordinary man. It wasn't only a moment of vulnerability. There was more to this. My thoughts were blank as I sat there and stared at the wall. How long had this been going on? It was all ruined in a few minutes. I felt like screaming. I wanted to shatter something. My intention was to rouse her and insist on an explanation. However, what was she able to say? What justification could she offer to lessen the pain of this? Nothing. Therefore, further discussion was not possible. I didn't say anything to Rose the following morning. As though nothing had happened, I saw her joke with Ethan and Jake, give them a quick kiss on the forehead, and send them off to school. I spoke as soon as the door closed behind them. Take a seat. Confused, she turned to face me. What? Take a seat. She must have realized I wasn't kidding by the tone of my voice because she lowered herself carefully onto the couch. I took my phone out, played the video, and gave it to her. She scowled as she accepted it and hit play. I closely examined her face, noting how her lips parted and how her breath caught as comprehension dawned. Her face was devoid of color. Her eyes darted from me to the TV as she put one palm over her mouth. She remained silent for a moment. Then she muttered, "Jeff, please," in a tremulous voice. I waited with my arms folded. She took a deep breath. It had no meaning. It was an error. I still adore you. I gave a little sour laugh. A mistake? Forgetting to obtain milk is a mistake. This, I pointed to the telephone. This was an option again and again. Her eyes filled with tears. I promise it had no significance. Stop saying that, I interrupted, speaking quietly. Because you brought him into our house, because it meant enough, into our bed. I gave a head shake. Do you not understand? There is no longer any trust. What you did is irreparable. I resisted her attempt to take my hand. Her voice cracked as she pleaded, "Jeff, please, avoid doing this. Don't discard everything." I got up and glanced down at her. "Rose, it wasn't me who threw it away. You did." I didn't speak again. I simply turned and proceeded down the corridor. I took a duffel bag out of the closet and began packing in the bedroom, the same one that now felt damaged. I packed jeans, a couple of shirts, and a few necessities. There was just enough to sustain me for a few days. My chest felt hollow, as if I were seeing myself from the outside, but my hands were steady. Rose stood in the doorway, her lips quivering and her eyes crimson. "Where are you heading?" I zipped up the bag. "I can't remain here." She moved forward a little. "Please, Jeff." I swept by her without turning around. I didn't stop until I got into my car and started the motor. Even though my head was a complete jumble, I knew precisely where I was headed. The home of my mother. She was shocked to see me standing there with a backpack draped over my shoulder when she answered the door. "Jeff? What's happening?" I breathed out slowly. "May I enter?" With a worried expression on her face, she moved aside right away. The words simply flowed out of my mouth as soon as I sat down. The cameras, the video, the treachery. She listened, her face changing from surprise to grief to subdued rage. At last, she reached out to hold my hand and whispered, "Oh, Jeff, I sincerely apologize." I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. "I'm finished, Mom. I am unable to return." She gave a sympathetic nod. "Then don't." I immediately went to a lawyer the following morning. It seemed unreal to file for divorce, yet there was no reluctance. I had no interest in explanations or second chances. All I wanted was to get out. But something continued to bother me as I left the lawyer's office. The individual. Who was he? Thus, I engaged a private detective. I shared everything I knew with him, including the video, descriptions, and any other information that would be useful. He gave me a call back a few days later. "I located him," he declared. I tightened my hold on the phone. "Who is he?" He seemed to be bracing himself during the brief silence. "Mark is his name. He teaches at the school where your children attend." It was unbelievable to me. An instructor. It was a man from our children's school, not just any man. Someone who sneaked about with their mother, saw my sons every day, and smiled at them in the corridors. I tried to quiet the tempest inside of me while sitting in my car outside of my mother's house and holding on to the steering wheel. However, it could not be stopped. I had to face her. For the final time, I drove back to the house that night. Ethan and Jake came running up to me as soon as I entered, obviously missing me. Rose was standing motionless next to the kitchen when I looked at her. She wasn't prepared for me to arrive. I knelt down and gave my boys a tight hug, despite the weight in my chest. I spoke steadily as I said, "I love you both so much. However, I must speak with your mother for a little while, should I?" They paused and glanced at one another before making their way slowly to their room. As soon as they left, I turned to face Rose. I remarked in a low but piercing voice, "You're cheating on me with our son's teacher." Rose is his instructor. It's unbelievable. She took a deep breath. "Please, Jeff," I interrupted her, saying, "I don't want to hear it. I am aware of his identity. I have all the necessary information. Additionally, I would like you to be aware that I have already filed for divorce." Her gaze expanded. "You what?" "It's finished. I gave the words time to register. I'm making my decision now that you've made yours." She briefly gave off the impression that she wished to argue, plead, or clarify. However, nothing more could be said. I no longer called this place home. I went immediately to the school the following morning and asked to speak with the principal. I made it apparent to him that it was inappropriate for a teacher to have an affair with a student's mother when I presented him with the evidence. The principal, who was obviously upset, promised to take the proper steps. Mark was let go at the conclusion of the day. The divorce proceedings proceeded swiftly. We both came to the realization that there was no way to resolve this. At first, Rose tried everything: promises, tears, and apologies, but it didn't help. Nothing she said could repair the damage she did to our family. She kept the house, but we divided everything equally, and I moved into a little apartment in the heart of the city. However, determining custody was the most difficult aspect. I couldn't stand the idea of seeing their mother every day, but I also didn't want to take the boys away from her. We ultimately decided on split custody, with her having weekdays and me having weekends. Even though it wasn't ideal, I still had my boys. I felt lighter when I left the courthouse on the day the divorce was finalized. I was no longer trapped, yet the hurt and betrayal were still present. I was free, I was dignified, and I had a future to rebuild. And it was sufficient. The weeks following the divorce passed quickly. It felt more like a makeshift shelter than a home when I moved into my tiny apartment downtown. There was a deafening silence, scant furnishings, and naked walls. The TV hum, my boys' laughter, and Ethan and Jake's occasional arguments were all different from my life. All I could hear now was the echo of my own thoughts. I made an effort to concentrate on my work, immersing myself in tasks and due dates. For a few hours each day at least, it was helpful. However, the weight of everything would fall anew each time I returned home to that empty flat. Weekends spent with the boys were the most difficult. They could feel the tension, but they were too little to truly comprehend what had transpired. The older one, Ethan, would pose harmless but incisive inquiries. "Dad, why don't you move in with us? Why aren't we all able to be together as we used to?" At least I didn't know the solutions that wouldn't harm them. Therefore, I would distract, alter the topic, or divert them with a movie or a trip to the park. However, the questions persisted, and each one made my chest twist like a knife. For her part, Rose made an effort to maintain positive relations. She would text me information about the boys, including school functions, doctor's appointments, and little life events that I could have missed. Although I was grateful for the attempt, each message served as a reminder of what I had lost. I took the boys to a park one Saturday morning. It was one of those cool October days when the sunlight feels golden and the air smells like leaves. I followed behind, drinking coffee from a thermos, as Ethan and Jake rushed ahead, chasing each other around the playground. It felt almost normal for a second. Then Ethan paused in the middle of his run and looked at me gravely. "Is Mom depressed? Dad?" I froze, taken aback. "What are you saying, friend?" He kicked at a heap of leaves and shrugged. "She occasionally tears. She sometimes sheds tears when she thinks we are asleep at night." I can hear her. My heart fell. Placing a hand on his shoulder, I lowered myself to his level. "Your mother is currently going through a difficult period, but above everything, she loves you and Jake. I also do. That will never alter, no matter what occurs." Ethan nodded, but it was clear to me that he was not entirely you. I hardly comprehended it myself. Hardly comprehended it. I began to get used to a new schedule as the weeks stretched into months. Weekends spent with the boys, work, and nights spent by myself at my apartment. Even if it wasn't the life I had planned, I was determined to make the most of it because it was mine. Then, one evening, a call from an unidentified number buzzed through my phone. Something compelled me to respond even though I nearly ignored it. "Jeff? It's Greg, your neighbor." I scowled. Since Greg had informed me about the cameras that evening, we had not spoken. "Hi, Greg. What is going on?" He seemed to be picking his words carefully because of the silence. "I don't want to cause any trouble, but I felt you should be aware of this. A man has been visiting your former residence. Late in the evening. I've now seen him several times. I was filled with nausea. How does he appear?" He was big, stocky, and wore a dark jacket, according to Greg. I tightened my jaw. It was Mark. With a tense voice, I said, "Thanks for informing me." "No issue," Greg answered. "Just watch out, will we?" With my head racing, I hung up. Mark was at the house. But why? Was Rose still his girlfriend? Or was it another thing? I didn't care. I had no desire to become engaged. But I was furious at the idea of that man getting close to my boys. I passed the house by in my car the following day. The lads were in school in the late afternoon. I needed to see for myself, even though I had no idea what I was searching for. I waited after parking a few homes down. I saw him around 20 minutes later. Mark. He arrived in his vehicle, parked a block away, and proceeded in the direction of the residence. As I watched him knock on the door, my grip tightened on the driving wheel. Rose replied. Her body language was protective and tense, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. They began conversing when she went outside and shut the door. Then Mark's voice abruptly rose. Although I was unable to understand the words, the tone was clear, aggressive, hostile. With her arms folded protectively across her breast, Rose stepped back. I only needed to see that. I exited the vehicle and made my way over to them. At first, Mark didn't notice me. He was too preoccupied with Rose, his hands making wild gestures and his face flushed. You believe you can simply interrupt me? As I approached, he continued to speak. After everything, Rose noticed me first. She took another step back as her eyes grew wide. Mark's countenance changed from rage to surprise. As he turned to follow her gaze, his voice trailed off as he said, Jeff? I said nothing at all. I simply approached him, took hold of his collar, and pushed him into the house's side. "You're going to regret it if I ever see you around my family again," I warned in a steady, low voice. "You get it?" Mark's face went white as he gazed at me. He gave a brief nod. When I released him, he staggered back and muttered something to himself before turning and leaving. Rose remained standing with her arms encircling her body. "Are you all right?" I turned to her and inquired. She nodded, but tears were welling up in her eyes. I was unaware that he had come here. He refused to listen to me when I told him it was over. With a sigh, I combed through my hair. "Rose, you must use caution. If nothing else, for the boy's sake." Wiping her tears, she nodded once more. "I understand. I apologize, Jeff. For everything. I was unsure of how to respond to that." I simply nodded and made my way back to my car. I lay in bed that night and gazed up at the ceiling. A profound, agonizing sadness had taken the place of the rage. I didn't despise Rose, no more. However, I was also unable to forgive her. I just had to keep going for my brothers and myself. They were my world, regardless of the circumstances. And I wasn't going to allow anyone or anything to take that away. Following the altercation with Mark, life was complex. I had no idea what to anticipate from Rose or how our relationship would develop. However, we both made an effort to maintain positive relations for the son's sake. My anchor was the weekends spent with Jake and Ethan. We would hang around at my place, play video games, or visit the park. It was something, but it wasn't the same as living together full time. And gradually, I began to feel as though I was reestablishing a relationship with them. We returned to the park one Saturday. Jake was sitting on a bench behind me, coloring in a notebook, while Ethan was climbing on the jungle gym. Jake abruptly murmured, "Dad," without raising his gaze from his sketch. "Are you and your mother still in love?" I was taken by surprise and froze. I caught a glimpse of Ethan pausing on the jungle gym and listening. I inhaled deeply. "I care for you, and so does your mother. Since we are your parents, we will always do so. However, adults occasionally face challenges they are unable to resolve, and they are forced to make difficult decisions when that occurs." Jake's large brown eyes searched mine as he peered up at me. "But you're still our father, aren't you?" My heart hurt. "Always, friend. Regardless." With a serious expression on his face, Ethan stepped down from the jungle gym and walked over. "Is that individual to blame? The visitor to the house?" I paused. "What are you saying?" Ethan shrugged. But for a 9-year-old, his face was much too sardonic. "One night, I heard Mom screaming at him. She advised him to go and never return. I couldn't think of anything to say. I wanted to protect them from everything, but I also felt that they should be given an explanation. I said slowly, 'That guy, he wasn't a good person, and your mother understood that. She ensured that he would no longer disturb us.'" Despite his nod, Ethan didn't seem persuaded. "I dislike him." "Neither am I," Jake added in a little voice. I put my hand out there and tousled Jake's hair. "It's not necessary for you to like him. Please know that your mom and I are doing everything within our power to ensure your safety and happiness. All right?" For a brief minute, it seemed as though we were in agreement, as they both nodded. Rose gave me a call a few weeks later. My phone buzzed late at night as I was getting ready for bed. "Jeff," she murmured in a faltering tone, "I must speak with you." I took a seat on the bed's edge. "What's the matter?" A long pause ensued. I believe I erred. A large one." My stomach grew constricted. "What sort of error?" She inhaled deeply. "He has been contacting me, Mark, through phone calls and texts. Even though I've been ignoring him, he persists. He's making threats with his words." I balled my fists up. "What threats?" "He threatened to approach the school board if I didn't speak with him. Make it clear to them that I started everything. Make it clear to them that I am not a suitable mother." I got up and paced the room. "You must visit the police, Rose. This is harassment." Her voice broke as she said, "I know. But Jeff, I'm afraid. What if they accept his story? What if the boys leave me?" With my heart racing, I stopped pacing. "You will not lose them. However, you must not allow him to intimidate you. You need to confront him." "I don't know if I can do this alone," she muttered after another pause. With a sigh, I combed through my hair. "Rose, you're not by yourself. I'll assist you. However, you must initiate the process." Rose obtained a restraining order against Mark the next day. She had to go through everything again, including the harassment and the affair, which made it difficult. However, she succeeded. More for the boys' sake than anything else, I accompanied her to the courthouse. They needed to know that their mother was capable of keeping them safe. After that, we sat in the parking lot in a somber but friendly quiet. At last, she replied in a quiet voice, "Thank you for showing up." I gave a nod. I didn't help you with it. For them, I did it. She lowered her gaze to her hands. I understand, and you are not at fault for that. For several more minutes, neither of us spoke as we sat there. After that, I exited the vehicle and left. Despite the restraining order, Mark continued to act. Rose resisted his repeated attempts to get in touch with her. Eventually, the texts and phone calls ceased. The rhythm of life began to change. I adapted to being a part-time father, and the boys adapted to the custody arrangement. Although it wasn't flawless, it was functioning. Then, one evening, Ethan's school called me. "Mr. Carter," the principal stated in a solemn tone, "Ethan has been involved in an incident. You must enter for us." My heart fell. What sort of thing happened? It's difficult. Talking about it face to face would be preferable. With my mind racing, I hung up and hurried to the school. Ethan was sitting outside the principal's office, with his hands balled into fists and his head lowered when I arrived. I crouched in front of him and murmured, "Ethan, what took place?" "I hit someone," he said without glancing at me. Startled, I blinked. Ethan had always been the one who kept quiet and made peace. "Whom did you strike?" A student was present in my class. He was talking about his mother. My stomach turned over. What sort of things? When Ethan looked up at last, tears welled up in his eyes. He claimed that she was a horrible person. He implied that you left because she had cheated on you. With a broken heart, I embraced him. "I'm very sorry, friend. That shouldn't have had to be told to you," Ethan said. "I didn't mean to hit him. I just got really angry." I squeezed him closer. "I understand. However, please come to your instructor or me the next time. We'll deal with it together." After he nodded, I got up and held his hand as we entered the principal's office. It was a stressful encounter. The parents of the other youngster were present and not pleased. However, the principal decided to treat it as a learning opportunity rather than a disciplinary matter after hearing the facts in Ethan's side of the story. Ethan was silent on the walk home. "Are you all right?" I looked at him in the rearview mirror and inquired. He gave a shrug. "I simply don't like it when people say things like that about Mom." I let out a sigh. "I don't either, friend." However, individuals occasionally say things they don't comprehend. Although it's not your responsibility to correct it, it doesn't make it right. Although Ethan remained silent, I could tell he was considering it. After dropping him off at Rose's that evening, I spent a considerable amount of time sitting in my car and gazing at the house. It was no longer simply about Mark or Rose. The boys needed to be shielded from the consequences of choices they were not involved in. Even though I was eager to move on, I knew that this was only the beginning. Because the world had a way of getting in, no matter how much I tried to protect them. Ethan's school event acted as a catalyst for change. The boys were now the main focus, not simply Rose and me. It was our responsibility to ensure that they feel safe and loved, despite being enmeshed in something they didn't understand. Rose and I began talking more during the ensuing months. We started communicating more as co-parents, not as husband and wife. To manage the boys' calendars, including doctor's visits, soccer matches, and school functions, we created a shared calendar. Although it wasn't flawless, it was beneficial. Rose asked if I wanted to join her for coffee one evening after I dropped the boys off at her house. Her tone convinced me to say yes, even though I was hesitant. Our family had shared countless meals at the kitchen table where we sat. Sitting there with her now felt odd, like if we were strangers in a familiar setting. "How are things going with you?" she broke the stillness by asking. I gave a shrug. "I'm managing. The boys are keeping me busy." She put her hands around her cup and nodded. "They have inquired about you. They are specifically interested in Ethan. He is concerned that you are lonely." I gave a small smile. "I'm not by myself. I have them, and that's sufficient." Rose's gaze softened as she glanced down at her coffee. "I apologize, Jeff, for everything. I realize I've said it before, but I really do mean it." I leaned back in my chair and sighed. "I am certain that you do. I don't mean to offend you, Rose, but I just can't forgive you." I can't forgive you just yet. Perhaps never. However, I can proceed. For the boys. With tears in her eyes, she nodded. I can only ask for that. We sat there for a long time, listening to the refrigerator hum and drinking coffee without saying anything. It was something, but it wasn't closure. I began to establish a new rhythm as the months passed. I started reading more, went on a few casual dates, and joined a gym. I enjoyed having coffee or dinner with women who had no significant expectations of me. Feeling like a human again, not just a father or an ex-husband, was pleasant. Even the lads were improving. At school, Ethan had been seeing a counselor, which appeared to help him deal with everything. Ever the optimist, Jake was content with having two loving homes. I took them to the zoo one Saturday. It was one of those cool October days when the sunlight feels golden and the air smells like leaves. Ethan turned to face me as we watched the large cat move back and forth from the lion enclosure. He said in a serious tone, "Dad, will Mom ever be content again, in your opinion?" Startled, I glanced down at him. "Why do you ask that question?" He gave a shrug. "Sometimes she just appears. Depressed. It's as if she's acting okay while she's not." Placing a hand on his shoulder, I lowered myself to his level. "My friend, your mom has endured a lot. She is strong, though. And her greatest affection is for you and Jake. That is what sustains her." Despite nodding, Ethan's expression remained concerned. "Will she find someone else, in your opinion? For example, a new father for us?" I gave a small smile. "It will be someone who brings her joy if she does. And that's what counts, isn't it?" After giving it some thought, he nodded. "Indeed. I suppose so." I tousled his hair. "Come on, come with me to view the monkeys." Rose gave me a call a few weeks later. My phone buzzed late at night as I was getting ready for bed. "Jeff," she murmured in a faltering tone, "I must speak with you." I took a seat on the bed's edge. "What's the matter?" A long pause ensued. "I met someone," I said. I froze, my heart thumping with anticipation. "Oh, it's not serious," she hurriedly emphasized. "Anyway, not just yet. However, I wanted to share it with you first." I inhaled deeply as I tried to comprehend her words. "All right." Her voice was shaking as she said, "I know this is weird. However, I wanted to tell you the truth. For the benefit of the guys." Even though she couldn't see me, I nodded and said, "Thank you," she muttered. "Do you think they'll be okay with it?" After another pause. With a sigh, I combed through my hair. "They're tough, Rose. They will adapt. Take it slowly, please. For their benefit." She vowed to do so. "I'm grateful, Jeff." I hung up and sat looking at the wall for a while. I had a peculiar mixture of relief and grief rather than jealousy. We were both sorry that our chapter was really finished, and relieved that Rose was going on. I took the boys to the park the following morning. We went about our daily business as usual, but this time I had something important to share. As we sat on a seat and observed the ducks in the pond, I said, "Hey guys, last night your mother told me something." She made a new acquaintance. Jake and Ethan looked at each other. "Is he kind?" Jake asked in a low voice. "I'm not sure," I said, "but according to your mother, he is. And it's a wonderful thing if he makes her happy, isn't it?" Ethan scowled. "What happens if we dislike him?" I firmly answered. "Then you tell your mother. But please, give him a chance. You can be surprised by people." For a brief minute, it seemed as though we were in agreement as they both nodded. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on the events of the previous year, the heartache, the betrayal, and the drawn-out, agonizing process of reconstruction. Although it wasn't the life I had envisioned, it was still mine. And I felt all right for the first time in a long time. The situation has not yet reached its peak, but all right, and it was sufficient.